There's always something to deconstruct when it comes to the classic anime series, Neon Genesis Evangelion. It's a beautiful sci-fi story crafted by its creator, Hideaki Anno, reflective of his own mental health struggles, enriching the series to be a very vulnerable and honest piece of art to explore. One that opens the door to us viewers to relate in a way that can be both uncomfortable and surprisingly therapeutic at times. Set in a post-apocalyptic world waiting for its next doomsday, the story is often complex and convoluted, built on postmodernist themes and filled with symbolic religious iconography, though these themes often fall secondary in favor of exploring the many psychological and emotional traumas of its characters that put extra emphasis on the inner turmoil, grief, hope, and existential doubt that each experience. Evangelion's most powerful message begs to ask whether humans are willing to have the pain that accompanies life's many joys, to accept that as long as barriers exist between humans, there will always be pain, rejection, and abandonment, which only makes self-acceptance more vital for the individual to know happiness. Even more fascinating is that this is the main conflict to overcome story-wise. The danger of personal emotional trauma, more so than the threat of the world ending and ensuring human preservation. For such stakes to have more narrative importance than the pending apocalypse speaks volumes about the human condition. While the series does this in a mostly direct way, placing inner monologues about self-worth and belonging from characters like Shinji, Asuka, Rei, and Misato at the forefront of its climatic moments, there's also powerful subtext in the show's iconic quiet moments. Evangelion doesn't shy away from telling you about its characters' vulnerabilities and weaknesses, but it also endears us to its boring, mundane, and joyful escapist moments as well. Not everything in Evangelion has to be deeply significant or hold a greater message behind each of its themes, although we will contextually explore in this video 8 of its finest quiet moments. Scenes that are arguably better felt than watched. While an epic sci-fi story goes on in the background, a lot of Evangelion is just people coming together and failing together, finding connection, pushing each other away, and then isolating themselves and their pain, only to go through the unresolving effort to find meaning over and over again with rarely any evidence of the cycle breaking. Sometimes a lot is said, other times silence says it all. This is Neon Genesis Evangelion, 8 Quiet Moments. Number 1. Toji doesn't call Shinji. Shinji's student life in Tokyo 3 gets off to a rocky start in episode 3. After discovering he's put Toji's sister in the hospital during his first angel battle, as an act of revenge, he gets punched by Toji. Shinji chooses to not fight back though, and only reassures him he has no desire to pilot an Eva or fight the battles he's been recruited for, but at the same time doesn't necessarily relinquish himself of blame or guilt. He's not cocky or confident, but rather scared and off-put. He doesn't fight the fact that he is despised or hated by Toji at this moment. Instead, he seems more comfortable in feeling it's deserved. But when Toji and Kensuke are caught in the middle of Shinji's next angel battle, they're forced to take refuge inside of the Eva Unit 1 with Shinji, and become first-hand witnesses to him trying to embrace his own bravery, to choose not to run, and finally fight the angel even when told to stand down. The two classmates empathetically watch on in horror as Shinji screams and attacks, bearing the burden of being a pilot, and by association, his own personal pain. Episode 3 ends with Toji debating whether to call Shinji to check in on him after his battle. He debates with Kensuke over whether he's really concerned or not about Shinji's well-being, although it's obvious he is. Kensuke gives him his number, and we cut to this scene. The nighttime rain falls. He gets as far as picking up the receiver and dialing a few numbers, but after a thoughtful pause, puts it back down. His choice to not call feels strangely like resolve though. We sense his respect for Shinji without the need to hear it said aloud. Shinji doesn't know that Toji cares at this point, but we do. And we, the audience, are given the chance to accept Toji's silence and reluctance as a sign of respect, given how the scenes leading here have shown his evolution that began with feelings of disdain and turned into empathy. For someone like Shinji who feels he doesn't belong anywhere, our investment becomes greater knowing that there truly are others that will embrace him. His ability to not realize this for most of the series is only magnified during important moments like this. Number 2. On the train. Shinji runs away at the beginning of episode 4 after his last angel fight, caving under the pressure of becoming a pilot. Not much is said throughout his runaway sequence, especially where it begins, on the train at night. As passengers fade in and out, Shinji keeps his head down as he listens to his tape from front to back, staying motionless as the train goes from one end of the line to the other. We hear nothing but the muffled noise of his tape deck, the rattling of the train, and the announcements from the conductors. There is no indication that Shinji is thinking of anything, not a plan or sense of knowing what he's doing. We never hear him utter any words until the train finally comes to a stop, and he admits out loud he has to go home. Home being back with Misato, Nerve, and his classmates, even though he doesn't see the value in someone like him being there. Shinji still has yet to find control over his own actions at this point, and you can sense that even though he's in a great deal of pain, he still sees it better to return to these people instead of being alone. Once he's retrieved by Nerve, Misato confronts him about his own feelings regarding being a pilot, and Shinji says he'll continue to do it because he doesn't wish to inconvenience anyone. But this upsets Misato because Shinji cannot clearly define what he wants. She's frustrated at him, but for him, and we feel the same. That's when he decides it best to leave for good this time. Kensuke and Toji meet him at the train station, this time during the day. Toji begs him to punch him as both an apology and gesture of gratitude, and Shinji obliges. He tells Shinji that they understand how hard it is to do what he does, and that they admire him for it. We see Shinji perk up to this validation, but even as he departs, he still feels that he is weak and unworthy. At the same time, Misato realizes she's not ready to give up on him yet. Shinji stands waiting for his train on the platform, mirroring the first train scene, motionless and head down. The same lost and wordless feelings come through until he remembers Misato and her validating words, "Keep it up." As Misato's car pulls up, she's devastated to see the train already departing. She's too late. But as the train passes, it's revealed Shinji has chosen to stay. He still looks down and remains unmoving, but then lifts his head to acknowledge that he is in fact home. But this time it feels not out of fear, instead for perhaps the first time in forever, because he feels cared for by Misato and his friends. His first real victory in the series. Misato responds to herself as if hearing his words, "Welcome back." Number 3. Shinji plays the cello. Episode 15 gives us one of Misato's best lines in the series. It's not just the first step, what's important is to keep on walking. This episode is the closest thing to a slice-of-life-esque story that Evangelion has to offer. Misato, Ritsuko, and Kaji go to a wedding together, while Shinji plans to visit his mother's grave with his father. There's a certain everyday regularness brought to the world, or rather a glimpse at how people still make an effort to celebrate an idea of normal when it's anything but. Shinji and his father have a short conversation at his mother's grave, and as Gendo leaves, Shinji is able to work up the courage to let his father know it was nice to talk with him, to which Gendo responds coldly, "I see." There's only a bit of comfort in Shinji's smile here, but it feels like progress nonetheless. He's taken the first step and feels strong enough to keep going. Once he returns home, we find out Shinji can play the cello. There was no mention of it previously, but it's a nice discovery to know there's more to him than we originally thought. That he is more than just his trauma, and he is in fact considerably talented. He serenades no one but himself and a napping Pin-Pin, staring out at the sunset before Asuka appears and starts clapping, even mildly impressed. There's a peacefulness in his confidence at this moment, and though it's a lesson that doesn't necessarily last long, it's enough to make us appreciate another meaningful victory for Shinji among his many ups and downs. Number 4. Toji gets selected. Where episode 18 ends in tragedy with the Eva Unit 1 viciously destroying Eva Unit 3, to Shinji's horrifying discovery that it's being piloted by none other than his friend Toji, episode 17 is where this agony really begins. For additional context, the story reaches a point around this time that, if there was any sentimentality built between the characters, it starts to erode here. Shinji and Asuka's sync rates drop as they lose their grip on their emotional stability. Misato starts to grow more agitated with Ritsuko's allegiance to her duty and Nerve as plans continue to urgently unfold. Kaji keeps digging into Nerve and Sile's dealings, getting dangerously closer and closer to meeting his eventual end. But what really blows the cap off to set up the hopeless background to Evangelion's finale is Toji's first and last battle as an Eva pilot. But first we are made to watch him silently process it all alone. The most powerful aspect in these scenes is that all detail, information, and even the revelation is told off screen. It's never explicitly said out loud at any moment that Toji has been chosen, leaving us in the dark even though we're made obviously aware that he has been the one selected. To make matters worse, almost everyone learns of this but decides to withhold from letting Shinji know. Also intermixed in this story is Hikari. Her romantic feelings for Toji become known, and it's another great example of the normal world always being at risk of being turned upside down at any given moment. In one scene, she's cooking for him. In the next, his body is being pulled from the rummage of a broken capsule. That is the actual world they live in. These scenes do great work at foreshadowing something going terribly wrong the longer it goes without directly acknowledging to us, the audience, that Toji is in fact the fourth children. In these moments, he could be thinking of many things: his sister, Shinji, or becoming a part of the greater mess that their lives have become. Hikari's hope plays nicely against Toji's apathy, perhaps something for both of them to long for. If he comes back, he'll get to eat the food she made for him. But as the episode wears on, that lingering fear comes true. Number 5. Rei and Asuka in the elevator. From the time of her introduction, Asuka is the most mentally defensive character in the series. She fights every second to keep a guarded facade, obsessed with proving to herself every waking moment that she is the best. And once this guard is finally broken during the traumatic scene when the angel psychologically attacks her in episode 22, she is the one that falls the hardest. She claims to hate everyone because she can no longer present them an image of perfection, or rather one that meets her approval. And because they are witnesses to this nakedness, she rejects them. Prior to this attack, her sync rates continue to drop, and her frustration and trauma begins to get the best of her. We can feel she's a ticking time bomb, but we're still unsure to how hard she will actually fall once she goes off. After another bad harmonics test, Ritsuko mentions to Misato about potentially finding her replacement. Asuka doesn't know this yet, but we can feel her anxiety nonetheless. Then we get the classic elevator scene between her and Rei. Asuka's silence is surprising and almost calming, and we're tempted with a sigh of relief as if we've been waiting all this time for her to finally find a moment to slow down and catch her breath. There is no movement, only a long, uninterrupted shot filled with sadness and hopelessness. But her silence is broken with resentment towards Rei, as someone who struggles to understand her own humanity tells Asuka to open her heart in order to pilot her Eva. But to heed advice from a place that isn't her own is threatening, so she lashes out against her. She calls Rei a doll, a word used regularly by Asuka, and ironically, given that her mother regularly mistook her for a doll before committing suicide. The elevator scene feels like Asuka's last chance to embrace a different way of looking at things that we hope she'll latch on to. If she can just look past the fact that she feels preached to by someone inferior, then she'll be able to bounce back, find peace, and unlock her true potential as a pilot. But then, much like with Toji becoming an Eva pilot, we're once again subjected to the worst possible outcome at the worst possible time. Number 6. Ritsuko's cat. Ritsuko's arc is a bit of a bell curve. At the beginning, she is shown to be devoted to her role in Nerve more than anything, a key operator in the shadows of Gendo's ultimate plan. She is cold at times, prone to spitting out emotional logic to explain the feelings of others. But as the series goes on, we learn about her more meaningfully through her relationship with Misato and how she ultimately reflects her mother's legacy. She and her mother's paths are the same. Ritsuko has followed in her footsteps as a brilliant scientist working for Nerve, carrying on the work of her mother's greatest accomplishment, the creation of the Magi computer. But with this similar path comes the same complications. Gendo uses both of them sexually and exploitatively. Both harbor ill will towards Rei. Ritsuko hates her because she feels she is responsible for her mother's suicide, but her hatred also exists because Rei has won over Gendo's affections and respect. And so her story ends tragically in an attempt to rectify the sins of her mother and herself. In episode 22, Ritsuko receives a call from her grandmother at her desk. Her old cat has died. As she comforts her grandmother, she stays emotionally rigid in her conversation. She says she's due for a visit and she hasn't visited her mother's grave in 3 years. She hangs up and remorsefully reminds herself again, the cat died. Lining her desk are 2 cat figures. Later, she is sent to Sile for sexual purposes not explicitly laid out, as she stands before them naked but emotionally detached, answering the committee, unfazed by any humiliation. Later, Ritsuko sits back at her desk and we catch a glimpse of the cat figures again. Her cat's death is meaningless in the light of Nerve's and Sile's great plans, and she starts to understand that she may be seen just as small to them despite her efforts and devotion. She is as disposable as Rei is, so she destroys the clones at the end of the episode. She hates that for all she has done and the legacy she has carried on, the humanity she has sacrificed holds no value to those that use her as a tool to achieve their goals. Number 7. Kaji's message. On the surface, Kaji's character is carefree and unconcerned from his first appearance to his last. But it's his sage-like wisdom that makes him unique given the circumstances of those around him. Throughout the series, he is constantly fielding attention from Asuka, throwing casual guidance to Shinji, and listening to Misato's pleas about her uncertainty and their complicated past. What makes Kaji one of the most level-headed figures in all of Evangelion is his ability to fully accept what is instead of fighting for things that he doesn't have, can't change, or may have hurt him in the past. Misato struggles with wanting to give in to her desires for Kaji because she's constantly reminded of her father when with him. When she finally does give in, she accepts her desires as valid and even embraces the idea of being indecent. But even in their last moment together, she can't help but compare him once again to her father. When Kaji dies in episode 21, Misato finds out through his last voice message to her. At this point, we know she feels fully accepted by him, but her pain is still tied to that same lonely feeling that he was able to quell. At the end of the message, Kaji promises to tell her the words he couldn't say 8 years ago, a promise of love she'll never get to have. Shinji hears her cries, but hides under his pillow to drown out her sadness. He's not only scared of his own pain, but any pain from others that surrounds him. At the beginning of episode 23, Misato listens to the message again and again. Her head is laid on the desk, and her space is full of filth. Her depression is felt through the house. You can feel through her mourning that she's still looking for answers from Kaji. Or maybe it's the motivation he provided her to keep digging into Nerve and Cello. Or maybe it's just to preserve the sound of his voice. She awaits his call, but she knows it won't come. That familiar loneliness returns in a room full of filth, longing to escape with Kaji once again. Number 8. Karu's choice. Karu's time is short-lived, but his role serves as a coda for humanity's time as individuals. Following episode 24, instrumentality begins, and humanity is combined into one subconsciousness. Karu's presence is a hopeful glimmer in what has been a dark display of human suffering. Karu understands the fragility of the human heart, and he loves mankind more for it. He sees that humans resent each other because they fear their own fragile hearts. But like Kaji, Karu accepts what is and sees the beauty within, whether it causes pain or happiness. He doesn't fear intimacy, and he loves Shinji openly without shame. When he descends down to Terminal Dogma to fulfill his duty to Cello as the 17th angel, he comes to understand their plans once it's revealed that Adam is actually Lilith. Upon this realization, Karu has no trouble letting go. He isn't one to struggle with his choices. He calls it the greatest freedom, almost like an honor to have the ability. And what he chooses is to die in order to save human life. He wants Shinji to survive because he loves him as he is, flaws and all. Rei looks on from above, carrying no emotion. It's a great contrast for the two characters, how they are the same, but how one has happily met his fate knowing he values his experience, living as and among mankind, and how the other continues to struggle to scrape the surface of human connection. Shinji has a choice here as well. Orchestral music paints this beautiful scene. Karu is ready to die, and Shinji undoubtedly is anguished in knowing what he will do, but must choose to do so first. The episode ends with Shinji discussing with Misato about his encounter with Karu, and how he regrets not being the one that died. Shinji still doesn't see the greater message that Karu was trying to deliver him. Instead, he just weighs in again on his own negative self-worth. Misato insists Karu cling to a false sense of hope, and that Shinji did nothing wrong. That hopeful glimmer of a spark dies again, as Shinji answers her, "That's really cold, Miss Misato." Evangelion is one of the few series out there that is improved by its unevenness. Between a rushed production and fragile mental state behind Anno's intentions, it sometimes rapidly changed tones and flavors throughout its run. Sometimes you're invited to delve into the pain of characters for several episodes before you get a non-stop run of action-driven story to catch up in order for it to all make sense in the end. The last 2 episodes were infamous and controversial at the time, but they do reflect the closest thing to a happy ending, even though you're left to wonder what the hell is actually going on. There's so much imperfection everywhere, but it allowed for a more free-form direction. In this video, we covered 8 quiet moments I personally felt added to this beautiful unevenness. But it's only a fraction of the many pieces you can pull apart and restructure again and again to meet your own understanding of the human condition and even perhaps what you need in this moment. The only thing that's clear while watching Evangelion is that the decline and growth of each character is the only truth you're supposed to take with you in the end. It's blurry and messy and lathered in postmodernist ideas that are unapologetically way too heavy at times. It's pretentious but honest, horrifying but boring. I believe its greatest achievement is that it fulfills Anno's greatest fear about the series, that ability to see yourself in it, for better or for worse. And because this is the intention it was built upon, the series executes this masterfully.